Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now then, for anyone with half a memory, the Salisbury nerve agent attack is horribly reminiscent of the murder of Alexander or Sasha Litvinenko, killed in central London in a plot which a public inquiry concluded was probably approved by Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin. Marina Litvinenko, his widow, now joins us from Berlin. Thank you for joining us. This must have brought back terrible memories, the Skripal attack in Salisbury. Can you tell us how you first responded when you heard the news?
Very good morning. Yes, it was a very difficult moment when I received this news, because I believed it's never ever happened again after public inquiry provided all evidence of death of my husband. But unfortunately it did happen, and now I'm reading every day a news from Salisbury and try to understand what actually happened and who might be behind of this crime.
Your husband was murdered 12 years ago, and then you fought very hard for a public inquiry. And after that public inquiry reported and suggested there was probably a Kremlin link, you got a letter, I think, from Theresa May, then the Home Secretary.
Yes, we had a meeting and we had discussion about what we might achieve after this public inquiry verdict. And after this meeting, I received a letter, and actually, I would like to notice what was saying in this letter at the end. I and this government am clear that we must continue to pursue justice for your husband's killing, and that we will take every step to protect the UK and its people from such a crime ever being repeated. But unfortunately, it happened again. It means something was not done, and a lesson what we received after murder of my husband was not learned.
What more do you think the British government could have done after that inquiry and the murder of your husband that it didn't do?
We understand relationship between two countries as Russia and UK need to be in a very high level. But we know Russia never support investigation of killing my husband. We know nobody was punished, and people who've been a killer of my husband, and we know they are not even suspect because police investigation was provided all evidence, they still be in Russia. And Lugovo even, he is a member of parliament, and British parliament still communicate to this parliament where the mother of my husband is a member.
Going back to the Salisbury attacks, of course at this stage we don't have any proof of Russian involvement. How sure are you that this was a Russian attack?
Of course, Russia has a very bad reputation now, and everything has happened in the world, or is as doping in a sport, or is involvement in election, immediately Russia in a front of all mind. But in this case, I would like to be very serious and take its all evidence, and maybe sometimes to provide the truth, and was it exactly Russia or any other country behind of this crime. For us, it was almost 10 years to provide this all fact and evidence, and it was all proof. And I want the same case would be made in the same way. It would be not politically motivated, and only after proper investigation we could say exactly who behind of this crime.
Because there is a sense at the moment that Moscow is almost laughing at Britain. I mean, President Putin talked about his enemies swallowing poison, and then a presenter on one of the Russian television programs was joking about Britain being a very dangerous place for Russian traitors. They kept falling out of windows, and the climate was very bad for them, as if the whole thing was a joke. Do you think Britain is being treated as a bit of a joke by Moscow at the moment?
Of course, it's a very bad joke, but it's a very important British society and government will understand these words and take it really serious. And all what we're talking about, sanctions or reaction for what happened in Salisbury, need to be very serious. Even now, what was saying from Moscow, you need to react and you need to understand, is there some kind of message? and you just not just relax and take it without any reaction after that.
So in her letter to you, Theresa May said, when she was Home Secretary, that we're going to take every step to protect the UK and its people from such a crime ever being repeated. What is your message to Theresa May now?
You need to be very selected who you are friend with. And when you allow people with money come to your country and make a business, you need to be sure what kind of money these people try to bring to your country. Because very often this money were stolen from Russian people. And sometimes it's a very serious crime behind of this money. And I'm absolutely solidarity with this all question and asking to unite it with all this action what was already done in United States, in Europe. So, I think UK has to do the same steps.
Indeed. You've commented already on the amount of Russian money that has gone to the Conservative Party as a donations. Do you think the Conservative Party should hand that money back?
I agree with this. Because, again, you don't know what kind of money you accept. We're talking about reputation. And I think this meaning very serious now. Your reputation has to be very clear, particularly in politics.
You're in Berlin at the moment, but you're a resident of the UK yourself. You live in Britain. Do you yourself feel safe in Britain?
Since what happened with my husband, I receive this question almost every my interview. You know, you can't say for 100%, but I would like to feel safe. I would like my son will safe because we are both British, and I would like all British people will feel safe.
Marina Litvinenko, thank you very much for talking to us.
There are rumblings in Westminster today that senior cabinet ministers are unhappy with the government's response to the nerve gas attack on the former Russian spy, Sergei Skripal, and his daughter. The investigation, which so far, at least, has identified more than 200 witnesses, has been going on for a week now. And while Russian state actors remain firmly in the frame, the government is yet to take any action. Joining me now to discuss what Downing Street could and should be doing is the former National Security Advisor, Lord Ricketts. Peter, lovely to see you again.
Morning.
Will there be a working assumption in government, in the intelligence community, that the Russians were responsible for this?
I suspect that people have been very careful to keep an open mind while they put the evidence together. And there was always going to be this gap between the entirely understandable public demand for action soon and the media pressure for that, and the government wanting to take the time to put the case together. I assume that with all the evidence that they're collecting, they will have a pretty good idea by now of who was behind this. And I don't know, but I assume that the finger of suspicion will point clearly to Russia. But the stronger the case that can be made, the more likely we are to get wide international support for whatever measures are taken.
Because it is certainly the case that the intelligence community, the public inquiry, remain convinced that Alexander Litvinenko's death was carried out by a former Russian spy and was approved by the Kremlin, specifically Vladimir Putin.
Yes, but that took 10 years before that public inquiry was finally held and that conclusion was made. And clearly, we've got to move more quickly. I mean, in 2006, the government did decide on the strength of the evidence that that was the most likely outcome. They found a suspect that they wanted to extradite, Mr. Lugovoy. He got back to Russia. The Russians refused to extradite him, indeed put him into the Russian parliament. So I don't know whether they'll be able to find a suspect this time, but I can understand why they're taking their time to build the really strongest case they can. If they've got 250 witnesses to question, it's clearly going to take a bit of time. But I suspect it can't be long now before we get the first statement about what the working assumption is.
Because with your former diplomat's hat on, I mean, in terms of what the allegation is, I mean, this is the inviolable of inviolables when it comes to international relations, isn't it? Another state carrying out or attempting to carry out a murder, an assassination on another state's sovereign territory.
It is. It's absolutely outrageous. And not just a murder, but a murder using these terrible exotic weapons, putting at risk all sorts of members of the public, as we've seen, police officers and so on, in a county town in England. And not the first time it's happened. So if the suspicions prove to be well-founded, then really the government have got to take some pretty tough action.
And then we led rather nicely on to the rather tougher question. I mean, what is that that appropriate action. It seems to me and to others that on occasions when this has happened in the past, the action that we have taken has not precipitated even the most mild change in direction from the Kremlin. So what do we do?
Well, in 2006, the government of the day did take action, and part of it was to really freeze any cooperation with the Russian on security and intelligence matters. We have taken, as a result, a harder line on Russia than any other country in Europe in the last 10 years. We took a hard line on them over the invasion of Ukraine, with the sanctions there. This time, we've clearly got to go beyond it. The problem is how. I mean, just trying to kind of find another punch which out-punches Putin isn't going to work. It seems to me we've got to make the guys in the Kremlin sit up and take notice that they cannot get away with this kind of thing with impunity, and that if Russia wants to be taken seriously as a major responsible country in the world, it can't behave like this.
It seems to me that you're suggesting tactics that are of a piece with what we've done before: expulsion of diplomats, perhaps going as high as the ambassador himself, increased sanctions on Russian citizens, increased ability, the Magnitsky material, increased ability to confiscate assets. But I mean, is there any evidence, given the old aphorism, might only respects might, that Putin will take any notice of that?
Well, as I say, I don't think we can't sort of trade like for like, so we've got to find measures that make very clear that, first of all, we're not going to accept this, and that Russia's behaviour is putting at risk its status as a serious country. I think going after the money of people who, we know have been responsible for major human rights abuses would be a powerful tool. There is a bill before Parliament now, actually. In fact, the government have not been encouraging it up to now. I suspect we may see a U-turn on that, and we may get a bill fairly quickly that allows the government to seize assets, for example, of people close to Putin who've been suspected of human rights abuses. Expulsions, I mean, I suppose there will be expulsions of, anyone in the security services and so on. Expulsions of ambassadors, it's a gesture. It gets a headline for a day. Actually, when things are in bad way, you need an ambassador there. We need our ambassador in Moscow probably to be passing the hard messages to the Russians. So I don't think that that's one of the game-changer issues.
To what extent is our response limited by the fact that there are occasions, there are institutions on which we need Russian assistance? I mean, I think specifically of the Security Council of the United Nations.
Well, I mean, you've got to decide sanctions which play to the objective you're trying to reach. So if you're trying to show that Russia cannot get away with this and be respected as a serious country around the world, you've got to find things which the Kremlin will take notice of. Also, we can't ignore, yes, that Russia is a player in international security, that we have commercial relations, that there's an oil and gas relationship and so on. I think we've got to look for measures which have the maximum possibility of other countries going along with and supporting us, so we get a multiplier effect across other Western countries. And, for example, more concerted efforts against Russian money coming into Western countries from dodgy sources would be one of those powerful measures, I think. I mean,
is it possible for us to sway the opinions of those in the Kremlin when our ability to project hard power is far less than it once was? I mean, would, as some are suggesting elsewhere today, increasing the defence spending from 2% to 3% of GDP, I mean, would that send a stronger signal than a few more sanctions?
Well, I think that's a decision that can't only be taken on the basis of what Russia has done in the last fortnight. I think the fact that NATO is increasing its deployments in the east of Europe to deter any Russian aggressive behaviour towards the Baltic states, towards Poland, that has an effect. I mean, the Russians certainly notice that. They would certainly notice it, of course, if Britain was strengthening its defences.
Well, they'll also notice what Donald Trump has been saying about NATO in recent times.
Yeah, and I think there's everything to be said for strengthening the credibility of NATO, the commitment of the Americans to NATO. I think it was a shame that Donald Trump took his time to do that, because NATO is one of our most powerful things. I mean, there are other gestures that could be thought about. For example, boycotts of the World Cup. I don't know whether that's really being considered seriously. Just England not going, I mean, it might,
yeah, might please a couple of us a bit more than
happiness
others.
into the hearts of some others in the British Isles. But seriously, that would only really have an impact if a number of countries boycotted the World Cup. That would certainly send a very strong message. But I don't know whether that would be judged, to be overall the kind of message we want to be sending.
Well, in our pursuit of answers, there is a press conference due to take place at 12:30 today in Salisbury, a multi-agency press conference. So we may creep a little closer to the truth of what actually happened there. But Lord Ricketts, thank you very much for joining us in the studio.
Thank you.
But the poisoning of Sergei Skripal and his daughter carries echoes of the murder of Alexander Litvinenko. He was an ex-KGB officer who died after drinking tea that was laced with radioactive polonium-210 in a London hotel in 2006. This morning, his widow, Marina Litvinenko, suggested Theresa May adopt those American-style laws that are tougher on Russia.
You need to be very selected who you are friend with. And when you allow people with money come to your country and make a business, you need to be sure what kind of money these people try to bring to your country. Because very often this money were stolen from Russian people. And sometimes it's a very serious crime behind of this money. And I'm absolutely solidarity with this all question and asking to united with all this action what was already done in United States, in Europe. So, I think UK has to do the same steps.
Well, joining me now from Edinburgh is the former Home Secretary and former Foreign Secretary, Jack Straw. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. Do you agree with Mrs Litvinenko that the UK needs to introduce some tougher laws, the likes of which the US has?
I don't think we should do this now. I think we have to take this in a very careful, step-by-step way. And so I think that the approach of Amber Rudd and her Security Minister, Ben Wallace, is the right one. Jumping to conclusions in a situation like this is not a sensible way to proceed. The other thing we have to think about very carefully when it comes to those who are saying something must be done, and if you're in government, you get this demand all the time, in situations like this, something's got to be done, is what happens when you need to get back to normality. And I often reflect on the sanctions we imposed in respect of Zimbabwe. It's a different situation, but has parallels. And I had imposed on Zimbabwe. In retrospect, I mean, Mugabe was a very, very bad man, but in retrospect, I often wonder whether it was a sensible thing to do, and it meant that having led the troops, as it were, up to the top of the hill, what did we have to do next? And in the end, we had to get them down again. It's very tricky. So people need to think very carefully indeed. This is all on the assumption that the Russian state was behind this, which has not yet been either approved or announced.
If we do establish that, if we work on the presumption for now, and I understand your reservations, would President Putin care if we were to try and institute some kind of sanctions or punishments? Or does it just increase the siege mentality that Russia's under threat from the rest of the world, which in many ways bolsters his position in advance of elections that are coming up very soon?
Well, if we were to do it unilaterally, just the United Kingdom, I don't think he'd care tuppence. If it was done in concert with the European Union, and still more in concert, say, with other major allies, including the United States, then he might well take notice. But frankly, I think he regarded it as a kind of medal if we were simply to do it by ourselves. And he knows that post the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, there's this huge amount of Russian money in the United Kingdom, particularly in London. And a Magnitsky Act or anything else like this is not going to make that much difference to the level of dependence of some very highly respectable British, London-based and some Edinburgh-based financial institutions upon Russian money.
You also, I mean, with the Alexander Litvinenko case, an inquiry took years to try and get to the bottom of what happened there and could only decide that it was probably ordered by the Russian state. Can you take any kind of diplomatic or financial action on the basis of something probably being the case?
Well, I thought about there will be huge demands for this, but people need to bear in mind the example of Iraq. The evidence against Saddam Hussein, having and continuing to have chemical and biological weapons, was overwhelming, without any question. And that was in United Nations Security Council resolutions and passed unanimously, including by Russia, and all the rest of it. That was the evidence Tony Blair and I used almost exactly 15 years ago to persuade people to go to war against Iraq. But it turned out to be completely incorrect. So you've got to be really, really careful. And I've got the scars literally on my back in respect of this. You'll be very, very careful in the heat of the moment with people in the House of Commons and the newspapers screeching something's got to be done, always being inexplicit about what, in assuming that probabilities mean certainties. And moreover, we shouldn't descend to the level of the criminal justice system in the Russian Federation or other states like that. So I see there are demands today from some Conservative MPs to ban RT, the Russia Today programme from the House of Commons. Well,
yes, you've appeared on Russia Today quite often. John McDonnell, the Shadow Chancellor, has just been saying this morning that he doesn't think that Labour MPs should from now on. Will you be refusing to appear on there in future?
I haven't appeared for him for some time, but I'd think about whether I was going to go on in my own terms, not necessarily follow the horde. We've got to be careful about why would we be doing that in the absence of very clear evidence. And it seems to me it is far better for Britain's position in the world to continue to have high standards of probity than not. And it's just worth bearing in mind, as I said, that how well-intentioned people who didn't lie at all, including myself, and the House of Commons by a huge majority and public opinion at the time, came to the wrong decision in respect of whether or not Saddam Hussein still had chemical and biological weapons. He unquestionably had before that, on the basis of probabilities. That's the difficulty here. And people will be, of course, be very impatient indeed to have a culprit here, and it obviously stacking it up on the basis of circumstantial evidence, you can make a very good case that it's the Russian state. But I think we just need a bit of sobriety before we come to that conclusion. Please God, and thank God, that Amber Rudd is the Home Secretary at the moment, not somebody else one could think of in the British cabinet, and she's taking a pretty sober approach to this.
All right, well, Jack Straw, thanks very much for talking to us this morning. And here with me in the studio is Pauline Neville-Jones, who was Security and Counter-Terrorism Minister under David Cameron when Theresa May was the Home Secretary. That was fascinating, listening to Jack Straw drawing parallels with Iraq and with what was supposedly the evidence of chemical and biological weapons there, and saying we have to be very, very careful about pointing the finger of blame. With your security experience, will we ever be able to establish whether or not this was sanctioned by the Russian state?
I doubt that the Russian state is going to admit that it was involved. And of course, in order to get absolute proof, what we needed, obviously, with Litvinenko was that there was going to be a trial. There hasn't been a trial. And why isn't there a trial? Because, of course, the Russians wouldn't cooperate. So I think we have to operate on the basis of probabilities. And I think it's right for the government to be cautious about saying anything now, because it mustn't be seen to lead the investigation and therefore damage it. But once we've established a degree of probability about the cause, then I think there is the time for action. I have to say that I think the chances of it not being connected with Russia are very low.
Well, the means would point to that in terms of the nerve agent used, but what's the motive? I mean, this is a retired agent who's been living here for years, came as part of a spy swap. The unwritten rules of espionage are that you don't touch spies who've come under swaps. What danger did he pose to the Russian regime? Why would Putin risk the diplomatic blowback that there will be from this by doing this now?
Well, I think we don't know. We simply don't know the full story. And I think there's plenty of evidence that the Russian regime is pretty vicious. And even if he was part of a swap, I don't think we can exclude the fact that the Russian state would decide to take action against him.
So we're looking at pictures of him and his daughter there. It's difficult to see what threat they pose to the Russian state, though, and is it not worth considering the possibility that they may have been involved in something else which isn't technically state-sanctioned?
It's possible. It is possible. It is possible, of course, that the mafia were involved. I think the question is who lay behind the mafia and where did that nerve agent come from, and how available is it, other than from state laboratories. So I think it's very hard to imagine that the thread isn't going to go back to Russia somewhere.
Is it possible for us unilaterally to devise any kind of sanctions regime or take action against wealthy Russian oligarchs living in London, even if we change the laws and bring in something like the Magnitsky Act, that would deter Russia from doing this again? I mean, we took what action we could after Alexander Litvinenko. Mrs. Litvinenko even got a letter from Theresa May, the Home Secretary at the time, saying we'll make sure nothing like this happens again in the United Kingdom, and now it has. Can we deter the Russians from doing this here?
Two things. I mean, there are already powers, which the government can use. I mean, one of the reasons why there's an argument in the Commons the other day about this so-called Magnitsky Amendment was that the government, in effect, was saying we've got the powers. Well, I think the answer is you may need to use them. You may need to use these powers, for instance, to investigate people who have unexplained wealth. and indeed increase the number of people whose affairs you're investigating. So there are
those
things we can do.
Although those people are not necessarily linked to Putin and the Russian state, so those would be two rather distinct things.
They would indeed. And you have to be careful, you have to be forensic about how you do this. And it requires effort, it requires resources. I don't think anybody can argue, that this isn't actually going to be quite a complicated job. But I think Jack Straw put his finger on it when he said we need to act in concert with allies. This is the thing that the Russians are really going to take notice of. At the moment, I think it's fair to say that though the Allies over time and with the disappointment of expectations about our relationship with Russia, we have gradually increased the pressure. There's sanctions, NATO has increased its measures on its borders, but we still have a great deal of harassment from the Russians. They are taking action in people's politics. They are conducting hybrid warfare and cyber attacks. And I think we now have to bring the thing together. We have to act as an alliance so that the Russians really do believe, and they see positive evidence of it, that an action against one is an action against all, and collective action follows. And we need to have a strategy, and I really do mean a strategy, which brings together what we do militarily, what we do to protect our societies in the civilian sphere, what attitude we take to broadcasting, and so on, so that we have an all-compassing way of approaching Russia, and we have a part that says we will also dialogue with you on terms.
All right, Dame Paul and General Jones, thank you very much for coming in to talk to us.